Hello and welcome everyone to the latest episode in the Incubator Think Tank webinar series. Just a reminder, at the end of today's webinar presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, so please feel free to send your questions in through the Q&A feature of the webinar. And now, please enjoy our conversation with Incubator Client Services Director, Kathy Haushen.
Welcome, Kathy Haushen. Before we get going, why don't you give us a little brief overview of your background on this subject we're talking about today?
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Haushen. I'm the Director of Client Services at Incubator. I've been working here for about 8.5 years, and I oversee the account management teams, the testing team, and the marketing team. So my background actually is in web design and development. I started my career hand coding HTML and building sites from scratch. And then from there, I moved on to project management and account management. And then here I am. Prior to Incubator, I was the web manager at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C. And for 10 years, I was the web manager there, responsible for all of the public websites and childrensnational.org, which is their main consumer presence. I'm so grateful to have the unique perspective of working with outside vendors as an internal resource, and then also working in partnership with clients now that I'm on the agency side.
Well, thanks for that. And obviously the topic today, we're talking about website redesigns, and some you've been involved with, obviously at a very high level, enterprise level website redesign. So you mentioned Children's National. So going through those past experiences, what project, I guess Children's National, great example, stands out for you and maybe best reflects every little thing that goes into such a huge project like this?
This is a nationally renowned hospital with 323 beds and 8 outpatient centers located in Washington, D.C. And the site serves a lot of different audiences: parents, doctors, nurses, medical staff, researchers, policymakers, advocates. And it was a really daunting project because it serves so many varied audiences. But obviously, because it's a children's hospital, parents are at the forefront. So we really had to figure out, how to speak to all those different audiences. But at the same time, the actual platform itself needed some work. So we had a website on a lot of different disparate content management systems. There were some legacy content management systems that were used, and then there was also some third-party content management systems that managed some parts of the site, but there wasn't one that managed all the websites. And then from a content perspective, there were a lot of dead ends on the website. So you might go into one section, but there was no cross-linking to other sections of the website. And so this website was a true overhaul. We had to do content strategy. We had to assess the functionality. We had to build a lot of the functionality on the website. And then we also had to re-platform it into a new content management system that we also had to find at that time. So we had to do a search for a content management system that would work and scale the way we wanted it to.
Right. Well, obviously such a project that huge with so many steps along the way and so many people involved. As that person responsible for bringing that entire project to completion, take us through or talk about a little bit about the steps, involved in that process. And, you mentioned talking to people, interviews, things like that, gathering information. So what would be the key first steps that anyone should know in taking on such a monumental project like this?
So first, I'd say you should probably redesign the website in the context of an overarching digital strategy. If you have a plan for what you want to do around web or digital for your organization, the web would be one piece of that. It's a major component, but now we also have mobile platforms and views on tablet. And you might have an in-house experience where you're trying to present information on a kiosk or digital signage inside a location. So you might want to think about the website piece in terms of an overarching strategy. But specifically for the website, again, there's a specific web strategy that you should look at. What are you trying to do from the web? But gathering information from that for that process would entail like interviews with your internal stakeholders, peer assessment of other websites, like what are your competitors doing? What kind of functionality do they have on their website? What are other local organizations in your immediate area doing? And then just collecting all of that information. I mean, you could also do surveys. You can ask internal and external stakeholders and send out some surveys. And then there's also the analytics that you're collecting on your website. So Google Analytics is a really great resource. And if you've been collecting data over a period of time, then you can take a look at the analytics in addition to other sources like heat maps, where you can actually see what people are doing on the pages using various colors on the screen, where a red would depict that there's a lot of activity in that area of the page, or a blue color would indicate that there's not as much traffic or activity on that area of the page. So you could take all of that data and then you can start to glean, what you need to do to inform the website redesign and what kinds of things you need to tackle.
Well, obviously those are the types of things, gathering information and finding out, from just the needs, I guess, analyzing everything before you attack this. But how important is it, would you say, along the way to set goals for such a huge project like this? And I guess just as importantly, how important it is to kind of sit back and prioritize those goals?
Sure, I think it's extremely important and this is a huge undertaking and there's a lot of different players involved. So you might have some internal resources on the web team, and most organizations that I've worked with, their web team is fairly small, less than 10 people. Most of the time it's just a handful of people managing the web presence for an organization. And so really trying to understand what resources you have and if your goals are achievable is really important. So I would say when you're doing that gathering process where you're trying to collect feedback from all these different people, there are a lot of different opinions and a lot of different feedback that you'll receive. But then you have to kind of marry that with, what are the priorities of the organization? Like what is most important? Take a look at something that's really visible. Like if an organization doesn't have a very strong, like a hospital, for example, if you don't have a very strong find a doctor or a services area, clinical services area, then those are two areas that you might want to focus on, because that's basically the bread and butter sections of a hospital website. So I would say that it's important to set goals, but it's also important to try to prioritize those goals in terms of the needs of your organization.
All right, what type of prioritizing that? What types of things would you say are kind of important things to look at as far as priorities? I mean, what are some of the more important priorities you want to look at? I guess for a small organization to a big organization, what's going to be most important that someone should look at first?
I'd say that Sometimes it is very difficult to prioritize the goals, but in all projects that I've been a part of, a lot of organizations tend to want to focus on a lot of the sexier things. You know, all the bells and whistles, the, you know, crazy video or, you know, very dynamic elements, and those are all great. Like, you have to have some of that. But I would say that when you're investing so much time and money into a project like a website redesign, the foundational pieces are really important. And these are pieces that might not be visible from the front end user per se, but they are very important in order for you to be able to build a website that's scalable and give you the ability to create some of those sexier experience down the road. So I would say, if you don't have a very strong content management system, I would say that's one of the things that you really have to put a focus on. You could do an RFP, but you should look at more than one content management system, because there's so many out there and it's really difficult to understand which one to go with. And there's a lot of opinions around that as well. But if you have internal resources like an internal development team, try to piggyback on some of those resources to help you maintain the site moving forward. And so I would recommend choosing a content management system that your internal development team might be able to help support down the road. A second thing to look at is, does your content management system have the ability to have complex integrations? Like, is it an open API? Like, are there open APIs? They call it a headless CMS. So if you have like a CRM tool or a medical credentialing system or some kind of system that you want to pull data into the website from, that's possible. Some CMSs are really locked down and you're not able to do that. So for a hospital, for example, a lot of the doctor information is in a medical credentialing system, and that serves as a central repository for that kind of information. Well, if you're not able to tap into that data and then pull it onto the website, then you're creating a whole nother database of content for the doctors that's really difficult to maintain and update. So that's the second piece, I would say. And then the third piece I would say is, like, look at user friendliness, not just from the external user, but also for the people that are going to maintain the website. So a lot of times, like I said, you have small web teams with these organizations, and there's only a handful of people that are managing the website. So you need help. You need to be able to distribute the content authorship. If the back end of your content management system isn't user friendly, it's going to be very difficult to have have people help you manage the content on the website. And then conversely, on the user interface side, you have to make sure that the user experience is really strong. Your website doesn't have to have a whole lot of bells and whistles to start off with to make the experience like really user friendly. And there are a lot of websites out there that are very straightforward, but they're still user friendly.
Right.
So I would say those are the kinds of things that I would just highlight when you're thinking about some of the setting those goals and really focus on those foundational elements.
Yeah, one other element, obviously in a website redesign, is the design element of it. How important is that from a standpoint when you got branding involved and making sure the site's looking professional? How important, obviously, is the design side of things?
So design is crucial. Humans are visual people, and so a lot of times the design is what helps bring the content to life. And so I would say that the design is really important, but the content is also key. And so having a strong content architecture, so when you go to the website, you're able to understand the way the website is laid out in terms of from a content perspective. Like, I visit a website and I have I'm looking for a physician for my child that has a cardiac condition. Like I understand where to look. So the content strategy is really important. But then also the design is really important in that. So once you have the content strategy laid out, then the design is basically built around the content strategy, and then the dynamic elements are built on top of that.
Well, I think one thing I'd say the most stakeholders will want to know, and I guess anyone involved in a major project like this, is how you'll be able to tell if the whole thing's a success. What type of things would you say are out there that can help someone determine whether all the work that was put into the redesign was ultimately effective?
So we work with various with clients at various stages in their web journey, in their digital journey for their website. And some folks have some of that information readily available. Sometimes they're able to, they have a really strong Google Analytics program set up, or they have a dedicated person looking at statistics, not only for the website, but across all of their channels, like social channels. But sometimes you don't. So it is important to develop some sort of success metric for a project like this. And it doesn't always have to be based on metrics. It could be specific deliverables. But at the onset of your project, when you have a group of stakeholders, you will be collecting feedback from lots of different people, but then there'll be a group of stakeholders that you should identify to help kind of guide the strategy and guide the project. And so just establishing what those success metrics would be, what does it look like if we're successful? What does success look like? And then have the stakeholders brainstorm about it, and then try to shop that around and share that information and see if it's on the mark with other folks in the organization will help along the way. At the end of the project, then you can revisit what those metrics were. If you have baseline data, then you can collect the baseline data from when you started, and then you can revisit that data at launch, at 6 months down the road, at 1 year down the road, and then year over year, whatever time frame that you want. But at least you have that information. And I guess another thing I'll say on metrics and success metrics, I mean, that could be the start of what you're looking at in terms of success, but that can change over time. So with web, I think it's really important to be flexible. You could have a vision for what you want to accomplish right in the beginning of, at that point in time, but then, 5 years down the road, or even 3 years down the road, that vision might change a tiny bit, or it might be, you might need to tweak it a little bit. But if the overall vision stays the same, if you're flexible in what you're trying to accomplish, and you're able to move and flex, even if the elements might change, I think that'll help make you more successful in your project.
Well, looking, one other thought you mentioned earlier kind of had to do with resources. There's small staffs, there's large staffs, large organizations, but in the end, you're still trying to present your brand in a certain way. You're still trying to get all your content out there. So I mean, looking at such a major undertaking like this, how much of this success and scope of a project like this has to do with just what resources are available? How much of that success is determined, by your budget, your resources, internal, external, all those things that come into play?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. Yeah, it's always, resources are so important, and you're not going to be able to get a project like this off the ground without resources. And so going back to that first website redesign that I did at Children's, I was there for 10 years. And so over my 10-year tenure, we actually did a couple of redesigns. We redesigned the intranet, we redesigned the public site like 3 or 4 times, and then we did some facelifts in between. But resources were key. So we had a small web team, and we were growing over time, but it's really important to assess what the internal resources are. I mean, you're going to rely on your internal resources most heavily. So do you have a content team? Do you have writers that can help write some of the content? Do you have editors like that can edit the content once it's ready? Do you have content people that can populate content, either on the web team, or do you have some staff that has knowledge in CMS and can help populate some of that content? And then on the web side, what kind of internal resources do you have in terms of web? Like, do you have project management resources? Like, can they work with a vendor and manage those sub projects within the redesign? So if you're creating a mega functionality like Find a Doctor during your redesign, I mean, that isn't a project in itself. Like, do you have a person that understands the ins and outs of web and can project manage that side project in the midst of the overall project? And then I would say, like, some organizations have internal development resources. Some of them have built legacy systems for the website, or some of them have had some kind of hand within the website. And so what are those resources? Do you have developers that can help? Do they have a content management system knowledge, or are they straight up like .NET or PHP developers? So those are all really good questions to ask and explore. And then after that, then you take a look at what the gap is. So if you don't have resources in a certain area, then you start to look at, do I need a temp agency for this to help fill the gap during this project? Do I need a third-party service? Do I need like a content management system? That's typically a third-party service. That's not something you build in-house. And so, what are those resources that I need? And then I would say there's one thing, there's resources that you need during the project, but a website is a living and breathing thing. And so it's going to constantly need to be maintained. After launch, that's probably the start of the bigger lift, is keeping the website maintained, making sure that the standards that you've established during the redesign are being supported and maintained over time. So what do resources look like on your team to maintain the website after this big go live?
Well, obviously, whether it's a 30-person team or a 3-person team, there's still going to be probably, most likely one person running the project, running the whole show. So what advice would you give to someone in that position on how to get started, formulating a plan? Or sometimes projects like this can seem so overwhelming. So for someone in that position, what would be a kind of a good, simple first step, for them type of advice?
I would say after you've done those interviews, after you've heard from your stakeholders, looked at the peer reviews, and you have an understanding of what you want to do, I would create a straw man. I would say, okay, so here's, at a high level, here's the budget I have. It could be $30,000 for a smaller website, or it could be up to, $1.345 million for a larger organization, like, Children's Hospital or Children's Hospital System. So I would say, yeah, so within the budget that I have, then what is possible, and what are the must-haves, and what are the nice-to-haves? And start just creating a straw man out of that. And so, for example, on the Children's National first redesign, I talked a little bit in the beginning of the presentation about how we had all these disparate content management systems. And in order to be able to manage the website effectively, and then also create other microsites, we had to have a really strong content management system. So that was at the top of the list, like that's something that we had to implement. We had to identify a content management system, and then we had to implement a cohesive content management system that would be scalable. And then just go on down the list. Like once you start with the foundational things like hosting, content management system, then you start to think about and layer on the other things that are important. Like what functionality do we need? Do we absolutely need? Do you need a find a doctor? Do you need an employee directory? Do you need, whatever kind of site you have to decide what is the utmost priority in terms of functionality, and then work on those pieces. And then I would say, just keep on going down the list, like from a user experience, like we talked about content, does the site not need to be redone? Do you have to do a full content strategy and revamp the entire sitemap? Or have you done that over time and you think that it's the sitemap is in a really good place and people are able to find what they're looking for? And so there's some decisions to be made there. So if you're not doing a full sitemap revamp, that would save time. So you could probably take what's currently there and then just make it look prettier. You could just layer on another design over top of that and focus on the functionality. So it really depends on where you are at this point in time where you're trying to figure out what to include in the redesign, but create that straw man, just a high level plan, and then work the plan. And then at that point you can start prioritizing and then try to get a vendor to help you with, these are the elements in the first phase, these are the elements in the second phase, and so on and so forth.
Great. You also touched earlier on the Children's National Project and what a success that was for you. Obviously, a lot of successes since then, and impressed that you were able to say 10-year tenure, by the way. That's impressive. But you touched on Children's National, like I said, what a great success that was, and many since then with the incubator. How excited were you to see all that come together and all those great steps? After all those great steps that were put into place, how excited that you saw that exciting final product that the client wanted all come together for you?
Dave, when I did that first redesign, I felt like this is an opportunity that not a lot of people have. I felt like it was a once in a lifetime opportunity to work on a website that had such national and international significance and that was so complex. It was the first for a lot of us on the team at that time. We all kind of went through it together. And we had a pretty strong or really strong content team at the time. And so a lot of the work, we had a very small budget at that time. And a lot of that went to our design agency, and then everything else was really done with internal resources, with our content team, our IT team, our web team. So it was challenging. So I've been really fortunate to work on lots of different website redesigns since then. But that first website redesign, because there were just so many challenges, it just seemed like a mountain that we couldn't, what's the word, like surpass. Mm-hmm. For such a, especially in the beginning, it just seemed so overwhelming. Mm-hmm. To get over that hump and then actually launch a website that was truly scalable. At that point, it was such a blessing, and it's really hard to put into words the feeling of that. That first web redesign will always hold a special place in my heart. And so it was really exciting, and it was a win that we were all able to celebrate together. And so it was great.
Cool. Well, thanks again, Kathy, for all this great information. Any last thoughts or words of advice?
I guess one thing I'll say is that when you are working on a website redesign, don't be, I mean, you're going to be stressed and it's going to be frustrating at times, but persevere and just keep on going. There might be some times where you feel like you're never going to get through it, but work together, work with your partners that you've identified, and really communicate openly, even when things are not going the way they should be going, because that's the only way you're going to get through it. And at the end, you'll be able to celebrate your successes too. We started off with that first redesign, and the site went through a lot of, Children's National Site went through a lot of different iterations of design after that. And so if you build that foundation and you work with your team and you communicate openly and try to stay organized, you'll get there. And then you will build a website that can be scalable over time. And you could revel in the fact that you helped build that initial foundation that did provide the ability for the organization to grow over time. So I hope this was really helpful for all of you. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me anytime. I'm happy and passionate about this subject, and have worked with a lot of organizations now with Incubator for 8.5 years, and every project is different, and every project has its challenges, but at the end, when the project is said and done and everything's live, it's a great feeling. And having that partnership, that true partnership with with the people involved in the project, you can't put a price tag on that.
Well, thanks a lot, Kathy. Great advice. And that wraps up another Incubator Think Tank webinar episode. We hope you found this useful. We'll be including, as Kathy mentioned, we'll be including some contact information for Kathy and for Incubator if you happen to have any additional questions about today's topic. Once again, thanks to Kathy Houschen. And on behalf of the entire team at Incubator, we'll see you in the next Think Tank webinar episode. A big thanks to Kathy for all the great information. And at this time, I would like to turn it over to Jada Montenegro from the Incubator marketing team to help out with our questions for Kathy in our Q&A session today. Jada?
Sure, thanks, Dave. So we have a few questions here for you, Kathy. The first one says, it sounds like you've been involved in a lot of website redesign projects. So what's a key lesson that you've learned during these?
Hi, Jada. Yep, I've actually been involved in a lot of website redesign projects. In the beginning of my career, I served as a project manager, and now I oversee the people that manage these big redesign projects. One thing I'd say is that documentation is key. A key component is the requirement. So at the beginning of each project, it's important to document what we're trying to achieve. And in those requirements, there are really 4 major components that a document like this should cover. So there's the technical requirements, where you're outlining what kind of browsers, what kind of devices the website should be compatible in. You're also looking at the server architecture. Are you looking at what kind of hosting environment are you looking at? Is it a load balance hosting environment where if one server gets overloaded, it flips over to the other server? So those kinds of things under the technical section. Then you're looking at the layout and design of the template. So this would be the makeup of what the actual website's going to look like and how the layout of the content is going to be formatted on each of the pages. The content and the sitemap. So looking at the usability from a content perspective and making sure that users are going to be able to move through the website and the content easily, and that the sitemap is the backbone of that content strategy. And so organizing the content in a way that is intuitive is really important. And then the functionality. So really outlining every single piece of functionality that goes into the website. So if it's a hospital website, it's the Find a Doctor module. Like, what kind of information do you want to present on the detail page? So if a doctor, if you have a doctor profile and you have a detail page for that doctor profile, what kind of information do you want to present to users coming to that doctor profile? And then conversely, on the search page for Find a Doctor, what elements and what fields would you like them to be able to search on? Is it first name and last name? Is it specialty? Is it location? Like, what doctors are closest to me? Those kinds of things. And so each of the functionalities you would go through and document what you would like to do in each of those functionalities and how you would like them to behave. So the requirements document really provide the instructions for all of the downstream processes like development. So it provides the instructions for the developers to be able to build that functionality in the website, and then testing. And so that the requirements is a really key component of a website redesign, I would say. And then I guess the other thing is really good communication. And so when we start at the beginning of a project, we usually outline all the major milestones with the entire project team. And that helps everyone understand from a high level what milestones you're trying to hit and in what time frame. So after you run through those milestones, then the project manager will typically walk through the tasks that are associated with those milestones. And then as those tasks are worked through in the project, then the project manager really sets specific touch points with the project team just to see where we are, if we're on track with hitting those tasks, or if we're delayed on those tasks. And so these touch points are really important because it's important to keep the project moving forward. And without those touch points, sometimes with everything else going on, the project will lag. So these touch points, it really depends on the client's availability for these touch points. So sometimes we'll do the touch points in weekly meetings. We'll have weekly meetings with the client, and we'll go through the status of the project and the status of the tasks and anything that's coming up for the following week or a few weeks down the road. But sometimes the client's really busy and they're not able to meet that regularly. So these check-ins can also be over email. So the project manager might send out status reports at the end of every week just to share the progress. And then a lot of the communication is done over email. So whichever way you do the communication, either through email or with regular touch points on a meeting, it works both ways as long as you have those communication channels open.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. That is helpful. So then another question we have says, if you were to put a time frame on a complex redesign project, how long on average do you think it takes to redesign a website?
That's a good question, Jada. I think with any redesign project, it's best to prioritize and identify with the client what the minimum viable product is. And when I talk about minimum viable product, that's what's the most important components of the redesign that you want to tackle in a first phase. Because a lot of times when you're building a website, it's just like anything. You could ask for the sky and the moon, but we have to decide on what's achievable in that moment in a short amount of time, or a smaller amount of time before we can we can get there. And so if you take that concept and first identify what are the components that you want to achieve in that first phase, I would say depending on the complexity of the project, most small to medium redesigns on average would take 4 to 6 months to complete. So when I say small to medium website, in my mind, that would be about 200 to 1,000 pages, maybe 2 to 4 pieces of functionality, core functionality like search, news, blog, forms, and that would include a new redesigned site, a little bit of content strategy, and you could also probably re-platform in that time frame. So if you're not happy with your current content management system, you could also move to another content management system. For larger websites with more complexity, and these are the websites that we typically handle, I would say it would likely take 9 to 12 months to complete a project like that. So a large website would probably be about 1,500 pages or more than 5 pieces of functionality. So in addition to those foundational functionalities, there could be some integrations that you might want to do with other external systems. There may potentially be a password protected portal. And then there may also be other custom functionality that we may need to build. So I know that's a kind of a rough estimate, and without knowing exactly the details of the project, that could change. But I would say on average, like that's what we would try to shoot for. Any longer than 12 months for the first phase of a website, it's really taxing on the project team. And so it really is a lot easier to and a lot more effective to break up a big project into chunks. And then that way you're able to demonstrate successes and achieve some major milestones with a time frame that's a little bit more digestible.
All right, thanks, Kathy. And then it looks like the last one that we had that came in, it says we'll be working on a redesign in the next year, and one of the things that has come up is the need for usability testing. So have you done usability testing in the past? And if so, do you think it's useful?
Yes, actually, the short answer is yes. I have done usability testing in the past, and it is very useful. If you're able to do usability testing, I think you should go for it. What it does is it accomplishes 2 things. So the first thing is that if you include the people that you collected information from in the beginning of the project, then that gives them a little preview of the site before it actually goes live. And so that gives them a sense of responsibility around the project. And then it just helps them become more engaged. And then the second thing is really just collecting that information in the middle of the project, when right before things are still able to be a little bit more flexible. So if there are any major changes, or if there is something that you've missed, then you're still able to fix it before you lay down that foundation. Because once you lay down that foundation, and especially on the user experience side, like if there's some pathways that are just a little bit difficult to execute. So if you lay out a scenario that's really key to the organization, but the testers aren't able to execute it well, at that point you're still able to make tweaks to the structure and the sitemap before it's actually completely built out. And so you're saving time in the long run. I've done usability testing 2 ways. I've done it with an outside agency. So if an organization has a little bit bigger budget, you can have an agency come in and do usability testing. So they would identify the participants that are needed. They would come up with the questions. They would help with building the prototype for the site. They would handle the interviews. They would videotape the interviews, and then they would distill all of that information and then present actionable goals or actionable edits to the product. But if you're not able to do that kind of usability testing and don't have that kind of budget, I've also done it internally, where we've identified our own stakeholders and really gone through all those steps I just ran through internally. So it is possible to do it both ways, depending on the budget that you have. But I think that in both cases, or in either case, you'll still be able to accomplish the things that the usability testing is good for, and that's to collect information from the stakeholders and provide them another point of engagement into the project.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. That looks like all the questions that we have, so thanks again for answering those. And then I'll turn it back over to Dave. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Jada, for your help with the Q&A segment today. And once again, thanks to everyone involved in today's Think Tank webinar, and especially to Kathy Haushen, of course, for her time, helpful knowledge, and experience on today's topic of website redesign. And of course, thanks again to you for watching our webinar today, and we'll see you next time for another Incubator Think Tank webinar.